her people used to reside here, but they were forced and removed. I'd like to welcome to the stage Feather Smith, please. Feather Smith has worked for the Cherokee Nation since 2007. She has worked as a tour guide at the Cherokee Heritage Center until 2015, and then she served as a cultural biologist before becoming the current ethnobiology manager with the Secretary of Natural Resources Office. And as the ethnobiology manager, she oversees the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank, and she helps care for the Cherokee Nation Heirloom Garden and the native plant site. Feather has a Bachelor of Science in Fish and Wildlife Biology from Northeastern State University.
Hello everyone, I am Feather Smith. If you have been looking, we've got Natalie, she's coming up here to get us set up. If you've been looking at your program, you'll see that our keynote speaker today was supposed to be our Secretary of Natural Resources for the Cherokee Nation, Christina Justice. Christina sends her deepest regrets and apologies. She couldn't be here, it just didn't quite work out. She got sick the night before we were set to fly out. So as a result, I'm here. Now I have to apologize for myself. I have had a sinus infection. So as a result, I'm mostly over it, except that I have the lingering cough and the dry, itchy throat, which really hasn't been bothering me unless I have to speak very much. So you guys send good vibes, hope that I don't collapse into a coughing fit up here. I've got cough drops and water, so I'm going to be committing some cardinal speaking sins because I'll probably be popping some cough drops here pretty soon. So as she said, we are with the Secretary of Natural Resources Office with Cherokee Nation. This is titled Ethnobiology, and of course we also talk about this being the Cherokee relationship with seeds. But really this is Cherokee Ethnobiology. It's the study of how we as a people interact with our environment. So this says that no self-respecting Cherokee would ever be without a corn patch. This is a very famous Cherokee quote who comes from a very famous Cherokee who really, this kind of drives home the whole essence of our being. Our ceremonies, our culture, our religion was all based around when we could harvest, when we could plant, when we could harvest native plants. And so it's just such an integral part of our society as a whole. So as we've already talked about, prior to the 1800s, we lived in the southeastern part of the United States. We spread across parts of the Carolinas, the Virginias, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia. But because of the Trail of Tears, we were then moved into into the northeastern portion of Oklahoma, at the time Indian Territory. So we now reside in that little red dot right there. That is the Cherokee Nation Reservation. And we kind of luck out because in the southeast, we are in the midst of the eastern deciduous forest. In that little corner of northeast Oklahoma, we sit just on the fringes of the eastern deciduous forest. We're also kind of on the fringes of the tall grass prairie, the cross timbers, and so what that means is that fortunately for us, a lot of the plants in the environment that we were reliant on here in the southeast, we still have a lot of that in Oklahoma. But it's much drier there, it's a little bit hotter there, and so as a result, we struggle, some of our native plants struggle there, and our heirloom crops have struggled there as well. So the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank was started in 2006, and it was sort of started as a way to preserve language and culture, but really the driving thought behind the seed bank was for genetic preservation. So what we actually did is we had a conversation. Our Cherokee Nation Council had come to us and had started a conversation because they wanted to see the Cherokee Nation represented in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And what the seed that they were actually thinking about at the time was the Cherokee Purple Tomato. We sat down and we did the research. We already suspected this, but the Cherokee Purple Tomato is Cherokee in name only, much like a Jeep Grand Cherokee. It is not something that was cultivated by us as a tribe, so we don't truly consider that to be a Cherokee seed. There's some different stories as to how it wound up with the name. Maybe the family or the man that cultivated the seed was Cherokee, or it might have just been because it came from what at one time was Cherokee homeland, but it was never cultivated by the tribe. However, what we did know is, again, because we were an agricultural tribe, we knew we had seeds, but we couldn't find any of those seeds. When we actually sat down and started looking for Cherokee seeds, we could not find any verifiable Cherokee genetics within the Cherokee Nation. So at that point, we began obtaining seed stock through a lot of research, a lot of hard work. We went all over the United States. We talked to multiple entities. Most of our seeds did end up coming from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which are located in Cherokee, North Carolina. But all of our seeds are things that we know came from us, or at least came from the southeastern portion of the United States. What we found when we started finding these seeds was that nobody in the world was growing the seeds for genetic preservation. So that actually left the seeds at risk of being lost, because a lot of hobbyists were growing them, people were growing them in their kitchen farms, and that's good. We need to have that happen to continue seeds. But if nobody's actually growing seeds for the purpose of making sure that the important genetic material remains unhindered, then you actually take a chance that over time those seeds start changing, we run into cross-pollination, it becomes something else, and so all of that genetic information winds up being lost. So that was what started this entire program. It was just started with the intent of preserving those Cherokee genetics. As it says, since the early 2000s, it was in the early 2000s that we actually started collecting seeds and the conversation started. The garden and the seeds themselves have existed since 2006. So this is an aerial view of the Cherokee Nation Heirloom Garden and Native Plant Site. We are located in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the capital of the Cherokee Nation. We sit just east of the Cherokee Nation Complex, which is our primary governmental building. And one of the things that we kind of started working on, again, this was really just started for genetics. We say all the time, if we had known what this program and what this garden were going to turn into, we would have done it completely different. We did everything entirely backwards. So we just started this site within the fenced-in area, which is the little brown area up there. That was the only space where we were growing genetics initially. We kind of look out that the spot that we have has a little natural spring-fed creek that runs right through it, and you can't see it because that's where all of the trees and river cane are in this picture. But because we had that natural waterway there, our elders came to us, our medicine keepers group, and they said that they wanted to see some native plants represented on the site. And the first native plant that they were interested in seeing placed on the site was river cane. River cane is indigenous to North America. It was at one time very, very common here in the Southeast. It was kind of like the plastic of its day. All of the Southeastern tribes were very reliant on river cane. So it made sense to plant that in there. But it came with all sorts of issues in doing that. And every year since then, we add anywhere from about 2, 3, up to 10, 15 different types of native plants onto that site. So it's really a site for people to be able to come and take tours. It's the site where we grow seeds for the seed bank, and it serves as an educational platform. After we had the site in place, then the next thing that we started doing is because we have a lot of requests every single year from people who want to come out and they want to tour the site, but they actually want to come out and tour it once the plants have already gone dormant. And so I was always getting requests from schools and from different places that wanted to come and see us in February or March before anything was really growing at that time. And so at that point, Pat Gwynn, who I will talk about quite a bit here pretty soon, but Pat Gwynn really decided that we needed to have something that you could see on the site besides just plants. That was when we started having the symbology placed into the garden. So it might be kind of hard to see some of this, but some of the easier things to see are like the big arrowhead, the rattlesnake that runs through there. There's also a turtle, a Cherokee water spider. We began looking for symbols that were important to us. Most of the symbols are things that you would have seen in pre-European contact artwork, stuff that would have been in our basketry, our carvings, but then a few of the symbols are a little bit more modern. And the idea was that with these symbols, it made it where, again, we could share more culture, it made it more educational, and it really kind of helped the spot to come together. It made it easier once we had those things in place to start deciding what plants we wanted to have out there, where we were going to place those plants. It kind of came together after that point, which is funny because we had such a hard time figuring out how we were going to make this happen. So it says we kind of have a wide species variety. We do grow corn, beans, and squash, which are the primary things that we were known for growing. We also grow some gourd, some tobacco, and then native plants as well. Out of the plants that we have on site, if we can get seed from it, then we take that seed and it goes into our seed bank and is given back to our citizens. So historically, Cherokees were known for growing, again, corn, beans, and squash. They are the three sisters. They were grown in a fashion so that they could all grow together. They were symbiotic for each other. Basically, you would start out by growing your corn, let it get about 6 inches to about a foot tall. Then the beans were planted around the base of that. All of our beans are pole beans. They need something to crawl up. They will crawl up that corn stalk, but as they do, they actually make that corn stalk a little bit tougher, that it's less likely to get blown over. And then they fix nitrogen into the soil, and of course, corn likes to eat a lot of nitrogen. And then the last part of that Three Sisters method, which came along later than the corn and beans, would be the squash, or it could also be pumpkins or gourds. They are also a vine. They're really, really great at branching out along the ground. They have really large foliage. And what those vines are going to do is all that foliage blocks sunlight from reaching the soil, which is going to help with moisture retention, and it's going to cut down on the weeds. The seeds that we grow are direct descendants of crops that we were raising and had perfected in our ancestral homelands. They are naturally developed to possess drought, disease resistance, and long storage lives. However, in a modern society, that's not always quite true. We definitely have our issues with these. So this is actually Pat Gwynn right here. I have been talking about him. He was our former Environmental Resources Senior Director. Pat recently retired this past year. He's luckily still on contract with us because we were all very upset when he retired. So I can still go back and ask Pat anytime that we need any help, and if we have a big project we're working on, we have him come out and help us with that. But again, I kind of mentioned a while ago that it was a conversation regarding the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway that sort of kicked off this entire program. So if Svalbard, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a big seed vault that's up in Norway, and it's sort of supposed to be like Noah's Ark for seeds. They take seeds from countries all over the world. They hold those seeds. They do some testing, some research on those seeds, but they hold those seeds for each of those countries. And if anything ever happens, then the countries can go back and they can pull their seeds out. It's sort of meant to be natural disaster-proof and hopefully man-made disaster-proof. That was the idea behind the seed vault. And so we actually talk about that quite a bit. Anytime that we get asked to talk about the seed bank, we always go back to that original story. And Pat had gotten to do an article with the NPR back in, I think it was 2018 or 2019. And as a result of that article, somebody from Svalbard got a hold of it, saw that that was our originations. We had completely forgotten, well, not completely forgotten about it. We had just put that whole thing on hold and had never reached out to them. They wound up reaching out to us near the end of 2019, told us that they would love to have our seeds represented. And so at that point, we started working on getting seeds placed into the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which we were able to do right before the pandemic hit in 2020. This is our chief here, Chuck Hoskin Jr. Standing next to him is our former Secretary of Natural Resources. He is now our he's now our Attorney General, and that's Chad Harshaw. And what they are both holding are the seeds that wound up going to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. So when Svalbard came to us, again, there are some things that they do with seeds. They have their own research that they do on seeds. They have their own testing that they do on seeds. There is a lot of taboo. You have to remember that for us, these seeds are sacred. They are seen in a spiritual, religious light. Some of these seeds are very, very sacred to us. So having research done by non-Cherokees, even research done by Cherokees is sometimes kind of a taboo thing to do. So when Svalbard first reached out to us, they said that they were going to need gallons of each variety of seed that we sent. And once we found out the reasons why, we went ahead and we talked with our medicine keepers, and it was decided we could not agree to that. We couldn't allow all that work to be done on our seeds without a representative there with those seeds. And so we had to regretfully decline. Then Svalbard came back to us, and we had some back and forth, and they agreed that they wouldn't do any of the testing. They would just store the seeds for us as a backup to our storage. At that point, we were able to agree. Then the next thing came along. Whenever it came time to do the labeling, all of our seeds, we needed really to be labeled within the Cherokee syllabary. They needed to be listed in their true names. and they had never had a request like that before. It was a first for them because they have very standard language that they use on all of their labels. But by the time that we were done, we were able to have all of the seeds that were sent over labeled within their true names, their Cherokee names first, along with our seal from the government, and then have their standard language placed on that as well. Here's an outside picture of the vault, and then of course that's actually him getting the seeds into their vault and then placing them into storage. We are the first Native American tribe that was represented in Svalbard. I don't know if we are still the only tribe that was represented. So out of that, we actually sent 9 varieties of Cherokee seeds. The first of those was our corn. Pictured here, we have yellow flower, colored flower, and white flower corn. As many of you are probably very aware, corn very easily cross-pollinates, and we were aware of that. In between any area where they would have been growing different varieties of corn, they required that there be at least 3 valleys in between those different varieties to ensure that there would be no cross-pollination. Flower corns are some of our older variety of corns. They're great ground in cornmeal, but our oldest variety of seed and our most sacred variety of seed is the Cherokee White Eagle seed. We have a lot of stories about seeds being carried across the Trail of Tears. When we had to travel from the southeast over to Oklahoma, it was so important to us to have some of these seeds with us that the stories actually say that the women were taking the seeds and sewing them into the clothing so that way they wouldn't lose them along that trail. Unfortunately, again, we had a very tough time locating most of those seeds. We were able to find some white eagle within the Cherokee Nation, but still the vast majority of our genetics came from the Eastern Band and Carl Barnes, who was formerly a corn expert. Cherokee White Eagle, it says here, tends to grow about 8 to 10 feet. Most of our varieties actually love Oklahoma heat, at least corn does. And so in Oklahoma, this stuff can get up to about 15 feet tall. It grows on a red cob, and the corn kind of ranges from a white yellow to sort of a purple blue for each of those kernels. On a perfect cob, every purple kernel would have that white eagle flying on the side of it. This is something that once we first got a hold of the white eagle corn, this is why we say that the genetics were in poor shape, because almost none of the kernels that we were getting a hold of actually had the signature white eagle on the side. And after years and years of careful selection as we were breeding this corn, we can now say that the vast majority of our purple kernels, anytime that we grow white eagle, now has the white eagle flying on the side of it. Now, the next varieties that were sent were our pole beans. We grow the Cherokee Long Greasy, Trail of Tears, black turkey gizzard beans, and brown turkey gizzard beans. Again, all pole beans, they all need something to grow up. There were some other beans that were attributed to us, and whenever we were given beans, we were actually given a bag of beans, and it was something like a 27 Cherokee mix of beans, and they had no idea the history behind most of those. And so through some research, we were able to pick out 4 of them that we could list names and list some history on, and that was what was added into the seed bank. Every year we actually vet seeds. So if we start hearing about a new Cherokee seed, we spend years kind of researching that, getting mostly oral history because very little is written down about most of these seeds. But we go as far back on the history of those seeds as we can before they are then added into the seed bank. Now, our Georgia Candy Roaster Squash was our last variety of seed that was sent to Svalbard. It is by far our most popular variety of seed every single year, and it's something that a lot of people are familiar with because it's not just Cherokees that have it now. You will commonly hear about candy roaster squash, especially around in this area. It's a very large squash. They can grow up to about 2 feet long, can potentially weigh up to 20 pounds, very sweet, most recipes calling for pumpkin, squash, or sweet potatoes. The Georgia Candy Roaster can be used. For years, it was the only cucurbit that we had in the seed bank, and so that is why it was those 9 varieties that were sent to Svalbard. Now, aside from that, we also now grow the Cherokee Tan Pumpkin, and this is one of those seeds that we've spent years vetting. We introduced it, we grew it for the first time in 2021. It was given to us by a Cherokee family that she was actually residing within the Cherokee Nation, but the seeds had come from the Eastern Band, so again, it took us several years to verify their lineage. They're very small, only about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. They tend to be sweeter than the candy roaster squash, but pumpkins come with their own issues when it comes to growing, especially these small little tan pumpkins. We were used to our squash, and with the squash we harvest it, because it's a winter squash, we harvest it whenever the stem dies on it, it starts to turn brown. That's usually the best time to harvest it. That's when it's the most ripe. You can't wait that long on pumpkins. Pumpkins get what we call, there's an official name, and we can never remember that. And so Pat and I aren't always great with your official terms. They get those little squirrelies on them that you always see anytime that we do the fake pumpkins. You want to harvest the pumpkins as soon as their little squirrelies fall off. Once those little squigglies fall off, it is good to go. If you wait too long, pumpkins can look really, really good and go bad overnight, and they literally explode on you. So anytime that a pumpkin goes bad, it splits down the side and it spits seeds out, and it can spit seeds up to about a foot. And we discovered that first time in the office because we would harvest our fruits, bring them back into the office and let them dry out on the rack. We had one that was harvested, we thought, prematurely, so figured it should be good for months and months and months, and actually come to find out we had harvested it too late. And it split and exploded all over the office on us, and we found out when we walked in because you could smell it. It was not pleasant. Now, we also do grow some varieties of gourds. Gourds are funny in that they are native to the Old World, they're native to the Mediterranean region, but they predate all European contact in North America. And when I say all European contact, Columbus was not the first European to set foot on the North American continent. It was actually the Vikings, but we know that they predate the Vikings as well. Nobody's quite sure how gourds ended up coming here to North America, but they are not, we don't eat them, they are used for utilitarian purposes. We grow basket, dipper, and jewelry gourds. Since they're not native to North America, even though we've been growing them for a long time, we weren't specifically the ones that cultivated these gourds. That's why they weren't included when we sent our seeds to Svalbard. They're also in no danger of being lost. Now, aside from that, we grow some native plants as well, and we do grow native tobacco. We have a long history of growing tobacco. We do give this out through the seed bank. Native tobacco is about 9 to 10 times stronger than that of smoking tobacco and nicotine content. So in most cases, this is too strong to smoke recreationally. We use it for ceremonial and medicinal purposes. Again, we're giving this out through the seed bank, and that can be citizens from all over the world. And so we oftentimes will have people ask us, if we're not growing tobacco for medicinal reasons, is there a reason to grow tobacco? And we strongly encourage it. It is a great attractor of pollinators. Butterflies love it. Hummingbirds love it. Every single year, I have hummingbirds at the garden on site. We never see them, though, until our tobacco starts blooming. We grow all kinds of things out there, trumpet vines and jewelweed and everything else that would attract the hummingbirds and that they love to feed on when they are there, but they don't show up until we have some nicotine for them. So they have their own little bit of a nicotine addiction, but they absolutely love the tobacco. Also, if you like to grow tomatoes, tomato hornworms are technically tobacco hornworms. This is their host plant, so they will usually feed on their host plant and they will leave your tomatoes alone. So through the seed bank, we usually distribute somewhere between 8,000 to 10,000 packages of seed every single year. We start accepting seed requests around the 1st of February, and they are sent out to our citizens for free. So the way that this kind of started, again, this was all sort of an accidental program. When we started this, what we were only trying to do was preserve genetics. And what we quickly discovered is that for our genetic stock, we really only need a few milliliters and small bottles to store our genetic stock that we're going to grow in the garden year after year. But we have gallons and gallons of extra seed left over every single year. And it was that first year they were kind of going, what are we going to do with all of this excess? Well, Cherokee crops were nothing within Cherokee culture was ever seen as being owned by an individual. It was something that the tribe owned together as a whole. It was a collective communal event. So these seeds aren't the property of any one individual or even any one entity or government, such as the Cherokee Nation. They belong to Cherokee people as a whole. So for that reason, we give all of the seeds back out to citizens of the 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes. That's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians, and the Cherokee Nation, but they are sent out every year for free. Those people are allowed to request 2 varieties of seed. We mail them, and they can be sent. I oftentimes do wind up sending at least a few packages each year internationally, but most of them just go from coast to coast here in the U.S. So we say that you will get snake bit, and we're not meaning literally snake bit. Of course, in gardening, sometimes things do happen. But you're going to have bad luck in gardening, and we have certainly ran into that. As I said earlier, we have all of these Cherokee seeds that were used to being grown right here within this part of the country. Oklahoma is much more humid. It's a little bit hotter, and it can also be a little bit drier than it is here. It's kind of funny in that way, both more humid and drier. And it creates all kinds of issues for our seeds. On top of that, we have a lot of invasives that have been introduced over the last 300 years that weren't here 300 years ago. So many of our plants have a hard time for that reason. Fortunately for us, our corn, which is our most important crop, loves Oklahoma heat, and we very rarely have issues with it each year. Our beans hate Oklahoma heat. Beans actually quit pollinating once it gets above 93 degrees, and so you won't get any fruit. You'll have beautiful plants, you may even have flowers, but you won't actually get any fruit on those bean plants. We usually hit 93 degrees in June, and we stay there until September. So it's very hard for us to give our plants enough time to develop, put off a good crop, and then have time to die back before it gets too hot. We usually will start planting beans in April, late April, early May, because otherwise it's too cold where we're from, and oftentimes too wet for them to be able to germinate. Then from that point, it's hoping that it stays cool enough, long enough to actually get some beans on our plants. This was the first year that we had a great year for beans in a long time, because otherwise we're usually struggling with that. Now what I actually have pictured here is the Georgia Candy Roaster squash. And in Cherokee at the bottom it says Osta. Osta means good. This is good, healthy squash. This is what we want our squash to look like. Several years ago we started having problems where the squash was just dying literally within hours. This says plan Osta. Plan is no. So no good. And what you're actually seeing, you can see all of the vines laying along the ground there. All of the vines, the leaves on those vines have actually just turned to slime, and they're laying on the ground. We've still got a couple of good looking green leaves there, but you can see all of that fruit. And the fruit at this point can mostly be eaten. So any guesses as to what our issue is if those vines start dying too early? Vine borer? Vine borer. It's seeds. If our plants aren't getting to grow long enough, we may get good viable food. We're not going to get good viable seeds. And for a seed bank, the seed for us is more important even than the fruit is. So we were having problems in that our squash wasn't remaining alive long enough to actually give us viable seed, and we couldn't figure out what the issue was. They literally sat out one day and watched the squash go from good, healthy plants that morning to dead by 2, 3 o'clock that afternoon. And they had been suspecting, was it a vandalism issue, was it a pest? And they were able to just watch it happen in front of them with it seemed to be no other external issues. And what we eventually found out was that it was bacterial wilt caused by the bacteria carried by a cucumber beetle. Cucumber beetles, whenever they eat on that squash, they transfer that wilt into the squash, and it causes wilt. For some of those modern varieties, it's usually not too big of a deal. It's unsightly, you may still have to struggle with it, but for our variety that had never been exposed to it, it was catastrophic. It was just killing them almost instantly. And it took us a few years, where prior to this, we grew entirely organically. We don't grow entirely organically today. Part of the issue is where we're at. It's kind of hard to do so. But then the other part of the issue is that we fight so many pests on that site, this being one of them. But we were able to start using a mixture of diatomaceous earth along with 8 dust, which really cut down on the numbers of squash bugs and cucumber beetles. And that helped get our plants a little bit stronger. We started bathing the plants a lot by just making sure they had more water than they would need, had a little bit of extra shade. And the next thing that we discovered is it wasn't always the wilt that was actually killing the plants. It was the wilt mixed with the afternoon heat, again in Oklahoma, because once it starts getting above 90 degrees, these plants already get stressed. And then you can put that wilt on top of that, and that extra stress was really what was killing the plants. So now we do something that makes all gardeners cringe. We water in the afternoons once we get above about 92, 93 degrees. So I go out every day with our automatic irrigation system. We set the system to run for about 10 to 15 minutes at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And all that really is doing is it's cooling the plants off. You normally don't want to do that because you take a chance on burning your plants, and also you're not going to get a whole lot you'll get a lot of water evaporation from that. But for us, it just cools the plants down enough that you can kind of sit there and watch the squash. If you come out about 1 o'clock, they start looking pretty wilted, they start looking pretty sad, they almost look dead. You kick that irrigation system on for about 10, 15 minutes, and they will perk right back up in that time. and then they just kind of continue that process. But a couple hours later, they kind of start to wilt again, but then eventually the sun goes down, it cools off, they perk back up, and we just continue that process with them every day. And through that means, we have been able to get our squash to work up a little bit of resistance to the bacterial wilt. So again, a few things to remember: everything doesn't always cooperate. Gardening can be hard work. So this says how many chainsaws existed in 1491. Cherokees are a people of the eastern deciduous forest, and when we think of forest, we think of trees. However, of course, trees are a very small component of the forest. They provide that environment for all of those other native plants that are going to grow, that for us were oftentimes more important for foods and for medicine. And so that's why we really talk about this. We didn't have a lot of chainsaws. The trees were important for us to a point, but they weren't the main plants that we were using. Luckily, again, these species span both of the areas. Out of our 7 most sacred plants, 6 of them actually grow within the Cherokee Nation. One of them we do have to drive a couple hours outside of the Cherokee Nation to find. So this is a list of the plants that we grow, or this is a list of some of the plants that we grow on site at the Heirloom Garden. This particular list includes native plants that have been given out through the past through the seed bank. We probably have well over 100 or more native plants on that one little site, which is only about 2 to 3 acres. It's not a very big site at all. Pictured here is sunchoke. So sunchoke or Jerusalem artichoke is a sunflower. The really special part of the Jerusalem artichoke is the tuber. You can eat the tuber very similarly to eating potatoes. Whenever you read European accounts of Cherokee gardens, they all say the same thing, which is something that we already knew, that our gardens were surrounded in hedges of sunflowers, both kitchen gardens, which were the gardens that were inside the village next to homes, and then communal village gardens, which were the big gardens that were actually located outside of the village. All of them were surrounded in hedges of sunchokes or sunflowers. And it took us a long time. So much information has been lost since the Trail of Tears. We weren't sure what the sunflower was or why it was being grown. And we've just within the last few years realized it was sunchoke. One plant can produce up to 5 gallons of tubers, and anything that will produce that much food is going to be an important commodity within a village. They're also very easy to grow. They're really kind of a weedy plant. And so this is something that we now give back out through the seed bank when we can get seeds. We also do have groups come out every year and do sort of educational days with them where they're able to harvest and cook sunchokes, because most of the people within Cherokee Nation have never had a sunchoke tuber. And everybody's first comment anytime that they learn about these and get to try them is, why didn't we know about this? And it's kind of amazing because they are native both here and into Cherokee Nation, but very, very few people realize that this is such an edible commodity. So this is actually a picture of one of our 7 sacred plants. This is the flowers of a redroot plant. Redroot is Salix cumulus, it's prairie willow. It is one of our most important plants. It's oftentimes used for ceremonies, which is why it's so important. But it's such an important plant for us, and it's very important for all of our southeastern tribes, that what we're finding is that this plant has almost been harvested out of existence. And that's really just by native people, which is shocking, because usually native people have better practices when it comes to harvesting plants. We're the only ones that use this plant. So it's definitely been over-harvested by native people. And we bring this up because it is such an important plant for us. It is one of our 7 sacred plants, and it's a highly requested plant through our department every single year from elders. That this is one of the additional things that our garden has now started doing. We take root clippings off of these plants every year. We had transplanted a couple of them into the garden years ago, and we get requests from people so often wanting to use the roots from those plants because it's become so hard to find, that we started, anytime that we have to trim these plants back in the wintertime, we take those trimmings, stick them down in some rooting compound, stick those back down in the ground, and we basically clone or start new plants. After we can get about a year or 2 with those plants, it depends on the year. We have anywhere from about 40% up to 90% success rate, depending on how the year goes. After we have a couple of years and they put out a good rootstock, then we can dig those plants up and we can take them back out to the people who actually need them and use them for medicine, and that takes some of the demand off of the native population, and it also helps some of those elders out who have a tough time having to go out and search for these plants. So this is a picture of our Cherokee Nation Medicine Keepers. This group was started around the same time that the conversation started on the seed bank in the early 2000s. And the idea was that we realized that plant knowledge was being lost. And what Pat often says is that we cannot be a people without Cherokee plants. And without those Cherokee plants, the Cherokee people don't exist. And so with all of that plant knowledge being lost, we were about to lose such an integral part of who we are that this group was started. It's a group of elderly First Nation, First Language Cherokee speakers who have a collective knowledge on Cherokee plants. They meet together multiple times a year just to share plant knowledge. And recently, their idea was always to be able to share that knowledge and pass it on to the next generation. They have finally started that and have a program for that. This is Crosland Smith. He's the spiritual leader of the Medicine Keepers, and he says that our capacity to do good is for all people, red, blue, yellow, and black. That the idea of how we care for these plants, this communal way of growing, is going to be something that's not just important for us as a culture, but something that we can share with everybody. So this is actually the Ethnobiology in action. This is a picture of some of their students getting to go out, harvest some Cherokee medicinal plants, and actually make some Cherokee medicines out of those under the tutelage of the Medicine Keepers. They've been able to make teas that would be good for things like coughs and sore throats and colds. They've been able to learn. A couple of them had never gathered wild onions before, had never had wild onions before. So we got to take them out, gather wild onions. They got to learn about how to properly harvest, place the roots back into the holes, cover those holes back up to ensure that the onions continue to come back each year, and learn how to properly cook those onions, along with learning about things like the sunchoke. All right, that is everything from me. Wadon, are there any questions? I think I'll be in some of the panels for the rest of the afternoon, so if anybody has any questions on anything, you can feel free to come and talk to me. There's probably going to be a lot of repeated information as we start the panels here pretty soon, because, again, I was not exactly expecting on coming up here today, so I got to combine both my presentation and Christina's presentation, but we'll go a little bit further into that on the seed bank.
I do have one question. For those who are not indigenous, do not have any indigenous heritage, like myself, would I be able to get seeds to help grow? And is there a way to give back to the seed program, or how does that work?
Or at the moment, and part of that is because of the size of our program, we don't have an easy way for non-citizens to get a hold of seeds, but what we can often do is get seeds to organizations. So if an organization reaches out to us, we can usually get some of our excess seed stock that we have at the end of each year, which is very limited, and we can get some of those seeds out to organizations. And then we strongly encourage for our citizens, once they start getting their excess seeds, we quit accepting seeds back. Originally, when the seed bank started, the idea was that we would send seeds out to citizens, and then they would send their seeds back to us after they had grown. That system didn't quite work out. Again, a lot of hobbyists, a lot of kitchen gardens, we take chances on cross-pollination. And so we did stop that, but we always encourage our citizens to share with their friends, their families, their neighbors. So there's definitely some means out there of getting a hold of them, but the easiest way of getting seeds directly from us would be as an organization. So far, fortunately, as far as the seed bank itself goes, now when we're talking Cherokee Natural Resources things, yes. But as far as the Cherokee Nation Seed Bank, we actually haven't had too many issues. It was kind of funny that whenever we're looking for these seeds, the USDA, I believe, one of the groups, had a large collection of Cherokee White Eagle corn that they refused to give us. We had asked for some of those genetics. We wanted to get a hold of them. They let us come tour the facility. They let us see them, but then would not give them to us. And then just a couple of years ago, they had all of the seed that had been sitting there in storage for years and nobody doing anything to it. And obviously different people within the program who reached out to us and wanted to give us the seed. And so we did eventually get a hold of the seed, but by the time we had gotten a hold of it, weevils had gotten to it. So most of it was unusable, but it still did find its way back to us. Mm-hmm. All right, any other questions? Okay. Well, don't. Thank you all.